Recently, I've been doing some form explorations. However, while the profile of these look the same, what I've actually been exploring is the foot. So this here is my original form, just has a very shallow concave foot, just like that. And while these have the same outer profile, I've started exploring modifying the foot by inlaying some features into the 3D prints I use to make my molds. So this is my first attempt, and it turned out that the texture here was a little too fine and I didn't get a clean plaster mold. It also wasn't quite the design I was going for, and round two was much better. This was much more close to what I was intending, and it came out nice and clean. However, for both of these, I just used my original form and modified the foot. So I just took this design and changed the foot up. However, when I was playing around with these, I had another idea. In the software I was using, I was going for this kind of diamond-shaped pattern that was all angular. However, I started playing around with the settings for the tool I was using to make this pattern and realized I could also make curves. And I don't think curves would work very well on this form. So what I wanted to do was design a form where the foot wasn't just an afterthought, but actually carried this idea of curves all through the design. So I went and made this in Shapecast. In particular, the outer profile here, and there are these radiuses, these curves, stepping all the way down. This is what the original Shapecast profile looks like. So it goes down, in, down, in. There's a slight draft angle to all of these. And then the other thing I did was I looked at the proportions of these. So these is actually the golden ratio going down, stepping down, all the way to the foot. And the original foot's flat. However, this one is not. So I went and drew this up and basically used that to cut out the foot of the 3D printed mold created by Shapecast. So using some CAD to do some post-processing. And instead of doing something angular stepping down, I also rounded off all these corners. So the color here basically represents the depth. So the black is the full height of the foot, so full depth relative to the original. White goes down, black comes back up, and white goes back down. So I wind up with this zigzag pattern going up and down as well. People sometimes ask me about the difference between throwing and doing slip casting, and one of the things that's relatively easy with throwing is to go and create a bunch of new forms relatively easily. Basically, you can sit down in just a few minutes and create a new form, assuming you have the throwing skills. For slip casting, there is more overhead in making the mold. However, with shape casting, it's much easier. All you really need to do is be able to draw one of these curves, and then all of the 3D models get created automatically. You need to wait a little while, it gets printed, and of course, creating the plaster mold, takes an hour or so, and then you have to wait for it to dry. So it is more overhead than just throwing on the wheel, but actually still way easier than the normal process for creating molds. So doing this kind of design exploration is relatively straightforward. And I've really been enjoying this. So playing around with forms I wouldn't normally play with. So I went ahead and printed up the inner mold, just sanded it lightly, get off some of the fuzz from the 3D prints. And of course I printed the outer mold as well. This replaces cottle boards and gives us a nice clean plaster mold. And the last thing I get out of Shapecast is a README that gives me the amount of plaster that I need. So with all that, let's go ahead and pour a new plaster mold for this design and see how it turns out. To assemble the mold, we just use some binder clips. There's a bunch of features in the mold to make that easy. And plaster tight. Bottom ring goes on. Just like that. Then we'll put the outer mold on. There we go, and just like that, the mold is ready to use. And I went ahead and measured out the plaster and the water we need for Shapecast, although this is more than we need. I'm gonna go ahead and do a plaster pour for 2 molds. I'm gonna go ahead and make this new one, and the last one, I had some problems with the plaster, so I went ahead and added that in. Kind of counterintuitively, it's easier to mix up larger volumes of plaster and not get bubbles. So off camera, I went ahead and assembled this mold as well, and it's basically good to go. I just washed it off, used a kitchen scrub brush to get off any extra plaster, and we can re-pour this one, no problem. This is the one I made in the last video. Let me go ahead and reset so we can get going on the plaster. So mixing the plaster is pretty straightforward. I measured all the quantities out given by Shapecast. That way I don't need to do any of the math. I'll take the dry and put it on the wet. And to do that, I'll use this. This was originally a kitchen flour sifter. I've repurposed it for plaster. That way I don't get any clumps in the plaster and it goes down nice and smoothly. I'm not impatient and dump in a bunch. I'll let that slake for 3.5 minutes and then mix for 4. You want to mix as vigorously as you can as per the manufacturer's recommendations, while being careful not to get bubbles in. And that's where the more volume helps. Basically, we have more space above the mixing part of the drill. plaster. Usually wind up with this floating island, and I've just been pushing it down, but I don't want to mix yet. Just let it hydrate. All right, our primary mold. Nice long thin stream, and try not to spill, which I always do. I forgot to put the binder clips on the bottom, so I'm getting some plaster leakage. Should have told me I missed those. All right, so small plaster disaster. Up to the top. I got an old brush here. This is a chip brush. Tap out any bubbles that are clinging to the surface, on the top in particular. And I'll go ahead and do the second mold. All right, there we go. Small problem with leakage because I forgot some binder clips, but other than that, this plaster pour went way better than my last one. Plaster was setting last time way too fast, and this is a new fresh bag, so much, much better. I'm gonna go ahead and let the plaster sit for, I don't know, about 45 minutes to an hour. That way it'll set. And make sure to clean up my tools before then. The bucket I'll just leave and break out the plaster once it is solid. That's the easiest way I found to deal with it. All right, back in a bit. All right, the plaster's all set and cooling down. That'll just break out. I have been wondering how many binder clips are needed, and the answer is more than 4 apparently. That wasn't the right way to test it though. So let's go ahead and demold these. I'll set our bonus mold off to the side. And you can see our leakage here. Luckily I caught it pretty quickly. And that's why I keep my boards down. All right, so the ring should just come off. Of course, I'm expecting some extra plaster here since we had our little oops. Yep, that's more plaster than I normally get. But this face here, which is one we care about, looks good. There's just a little bit of flash over the top. Came off nice and clean. And to demold this, I'll use my frozen isopropyl alcohol and water to make the 3D print shrink just a little bit. That's because the plaster expands just a little bit. Pull straight up. So looking at the 3D prints, we got a nice clean release. That's great. down inside. I don't see any bubbles, so that's an awesome mold. And then to reuse these, basically just need to clean off the extra plaster. Usually just a quick scrub with a kitchen scrub brush underwater usually gets most of it off. This one might be a little bit more annoying since there's more plaster on there. I just got an email from a Shapecast user that had just made 15 individual plaster molds from one 3D print, so you can make a lot of plaster molds using these. And the bonus mold, I'll do this one real quick. And both the bonus mold and the one we're working on are both basically 16-ounce mugs. I'm cold. Again, we got a clean release. And I don't see any bubbles. Works much better when the plaster mixes properly. This will need to fully cure, basically dry all the way out, which will take probably at least a few days. And then I can slip cast a pot with this new form. I have to wait, but you get to see that right now. The mold is fully dry. If it's still damp, it's not ready yet, so you need to give it some more time. Mine took 3 or 4 days. It's been nice and warm, so it happened relatively quickly. It can take up to a week. One of the nice things about the Shapecast molds is that they are basically as thin as they need to be. If you had this in column boards, you'd have a whole lot of extra plaster hanging around here. So that's definitely an advantage of the outer molds. Overall, it means there's less plaster that needs to dry. And the molds are much lighter that way, while still being strong enough and have enough plaster to absorb the water from the slip. The camera didn't record, but I went ahead and mixed up my slip and poured it in. And while I was at it, I went ahead and did some bonus molds. I went ahead and did the one I just made, as well as the ones that I did in the past couple of videos. This is sat for about 25 minutes, which is basically how long my other molds that are similar forms take. Kind of have to experiment to figure out exactly what works for you. That's a good starting place for me anyways. So go ahead and dump out the slip into the bucket. And flip it over upside down on my drainage table. And then go ahead and do the rest as well. I'll give these about 5 minutes or until the slip has solidified enough so it's not moving around. And then I'll flip them back right side up. That way there isn't a chance for the pot to slide out. Some of these with the draft angles will kind of slide down. Overall, I'll give it about 30 minutes for the slip to set before it's ready to be demolded. You can see there's a little crack forming there. That means the clay is drying and pulling away from the plaster. And down inside, you can see our form has telegraphed through, which is kind of cool. So I stick a razor that's pretty dull at this point, basically go down at an angle to hit the slip well and go all the way around. While it is not very sharp, it is sharp enough to cut through the clay cleanly. It is also sharp enough to dig into the plaster, so you want to make sure not to go down and take a chunk out of your plaster. And then I have a piece of cardboard here. I can palm these, but sometimes that causes the rim to deform. Give it a quick shake, and there's the pot. Got a wear board here. Go ahead and set it down. Overall, this is looking good. See our foot there. I see a couple of artifacts from the 3D print, but I think those will clean up with the sponge. I'm going to go ahead and let this dry overnight. I'll leave it covered since it's kind of warm out. That way the pot can firm up a little bit and we can get it to a leather hard stage, and then we can finish working on the pot. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and do the rest of my pots. the last thing I'm going to do is go ahead and mark this. I'm one slip casting it. That way I can keep track of how many pots I get out of a mold. All right, everything sat overnight. And it's still damp, but definitely firmer. So there's the pot. We can see all the curves going down and all the curves in the foot. The one thing I did off camera was I went ahead and stamped these. Getting the timing right so I can stamp my clay body is a little bit tricky. So I did this maybe like an hour after I pulled the pots. The clay would just crack at this point if I tried to stamp it. So we need to smooth off the rim. Since this is just the raw trimmed rim that we have so far, basically I went to round it over. And I think we'll take a sponge and very gently smooth out some of this. So for the rim, I just take a big sponge, twist it around, some gentle pressure. Just like that, it's rounded over. And for the foot, I'm going to do the same thing, just very gently. This could be glazed or unglazed. Since everything is set down from the lowest point of the foot, this could be glazed in, and that would cover up any artifacts left in the clay itself, or it could be left unglazed, which is usually what I do with my feet. It's totally your choice. And there we go. Any hints of the layer lines are basically gone at that point. So just a second with the sponge. I think the rest of the pot is just fine. So let's leave it upside down to dry. And since I have my others, I'll go ahead and do those real quick too. I'll go ahead and leave these uncovered and let them go bone dry and throw them into my next bisque. There we go. There's going from a design idea where I wanted to have both curves in the side of the form and mimicked in the foot. Made the base design with shapecast and then used some CAD to modify the foot slightly. Printed that out. Poured our plaster mold and then slip cast this pot. This one here is about 16 ounces, basically the same size as the other, so it's basically the size of my coffee cup. I think in the future I will go ahead and try and attach a handle. I think a handle attached to the side right here, a nice curved one, would look pretty good and mimic the form as well. But to start, I just wanted to get the vessel form working. It's been nice exploring some different ideas, even though these are still one-piece molds. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.